Welcome to Creatively Speaking Season 2 Recipe for Success. This is episode 6 with Mardi Michels, the founder of the blog Eat, Live, Travel, Write. I absolutely loved recording this episode with Mardi. I only knew some of the highlights of how she got to where she is today, but in this episode, she takes us on a deep dive that provides so much context around how a lot of food bloggers, especially back in the day, got started. This has always been something I've found fascinating because when technology was in its infancy, things were just different. And if one was curious enough, there was a lot to figure out, and there's a big payoff in the end. It was so interesting to see how her professional experience, along with her travels and her love for Paris, French food, and teaching, all collided to bring her to where she is today. She talks about how she got her first cookbook deal and what she learned through that experience. And then we dig into her self publishing journey and the unique publishing model she has in place for her series of cookbook chapters that she has been creating and selling on the KDP platform. There are so many inspirational moments in this episode. If you are just starting out or have been in the food blogging space for a while, there is something in here for everyone. On a personal note, shortly after Marty and I recorded this episode, she had a medical emergency that ended with an unexpected brain surgery. Thankfully, she is on the road to recovery, but that makes this episode even more meaningful to me, and I am so thankful to have had the opportunity to sit down with her to get to know her even more than I already had. So let's dive in. Hey, Marty, welcome to Creatively Speaking. I'm excited to have you here today.
Hi, Leanna. Thanks so much for inviting me to chat. I'm really honored.
Yeah, I'm thrilled. So I'd love for everyone to hear a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Okay, so it's funny. Who am I? In my real day job, I'm an elementary school teacher. I teach French as a second language here in Toronto, in Canada. I grew up in Australia and went to school in Australia, did my studies there, teaching degree in Australia, and I lived in France for 5.5 years after I finished some of my degrees at university. I was planning to go do a PhD in French literature. But when I was living in France, I just had too much fun, and the studies were became less and less important and sort of less relevant. It was like 18th or 19th century, like adultery in the novel. Not really, really fascinating. And I love that era of French literature, but not really very useful for real life. So while I was there, because I was a poor student, I started teaching English as a second language, which is often the route that people take when they move to France, especially Paris, as English speakers. And I realized I actually quite enjoyed the teaching. When I was in Australia and did my degree, I didn't validate the degree by doing any practical experience. So I sort of hadn't had any real experience of teaching. And this was sort of like being thrown in at the deep end. Like, whoa, here I am with 5 part-time English teaching jobs, running around Paris, 3, 4 times a day to different places. So the teaching became more of who I was rather than like the student, the literature student. Um, and then, you start earning some money from this, and you're like, oh, this is a bit addictive. I could get used to doing these little jobs. And I really did enjoy the teaching. So I worked my way out from lots of little scrappy jobs. Like I did tons of private classes. And I worked my way out from those sort of jobs, like cobbling together a living, to I got two really excellent jobs in 1998. One was at the British Council, which is like the peak of English teaching wherever you are. They were launching their Young Learners Center, which was classes for kids. So I applied and I got in, and we started in July 1998 teaching kids classes there. And I stayed on there until I left France 2 years later. And at the same time, I got a job at an elementary Catholic public school, which is also a job that I really enjoyed. And that made me sort of think, hey, this might be my thing. So I had these two great jobs teaching English for a couple of years. But I always sort of missed the creative process of writing essays and things like that. Maybe people who have been to university and it wasn't for them don't miss that, but I did. I love writing and creating things. So I didn't have any sort of outlet for that creativity while I was teaching because I was just too busy. Um, and that sort of came a little bit later on. I met my now partner in December of 1999 on a holiday in Morocco.
Oh, wow.
He is Canadian. He lived in Toronto at the time, and it just sort of felt like it was meant to be. So I luckily was qualified to teach French, and I'm able to come to Canada and teach French where there's a big lack of French teachers back then and actually still today. So I moved to Canada in 2000, and I taught French. That's what I did. Still kind of looking for that creative outlet, sort of eagerly looking to PhD and master's programs in literature or teaching, to sort of have that as something else to do on top of being a teacher. And because I had moved from France to Toronto, very different living experiences.
Hmm.
I really missed France. And so I kind of tried to find ways of getting back there as often as I could. I found a master's program, which was like a distance program, go to Paris for 3 summers in a row and then do distance learning in between. I'm in. I applied, I'm in, I did that. And then, so I was in Paris and Neil would come join me. He is now a certified sommelier, but at the time he was just a wine enthusiast. And we would travel around after my studies every summer to different parts of France and explore like the different wine regions and food. And it was during these trips that I discovered my passion for, I don't know that we'll call it blogging, but it was creative writing. It was on, you'll remember this, but many of your listeners are too young to remember this, but iWeb, remember iWeb? It was like a platform on Mac computers.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yes, that you are a definite OG, I would say.
Yeah, I'm the OG for sure. But I was looking for, because I was away all these summers, and I am the person that's in the supermarket, like, oh my God, look at these cool products. Yay, let me take a photo of it. Getting in trouble, taking photos of stuff in supermarkets still. And I wanted to share my trips with I've got lots of friends who live all over the world, and my family, most of them are in Australia. So the iWeb was like a private blog that you could just give people the address and the password to, and they could just log in. So it's my way of keeping my family and friends up to date with my trips. And those were in like, yeah, this is OG, like 2006, 2007. I both of those summers I did this blog, and my dad said to me, my dad is he's in PR, he's an ex journalist. So he's always, correcting my grammar or, hey, there's a typo or whatever, which is great. But he read them, and at the end of the second summer, he was like, it looks like you're just like writing about the food there. And I was like, yeah, because it's really interesting and people are interested in different things. And so when I had finished that program, what was it? God, it was a master's in second language acquisition. It was very hard, but the fact that we were doing it in France made it just so much better. But my dad had pointed this out about my blogs were just about French food. So when I'd finished the master's, I applied for, as you do, a PhD in second language acquisition. I'm still teaching full time at this point, and this is me like, oh, I can do that. Sure. Another full on degree. Yes, I can do that. Um, But I got accepted into the PhD program, and I think I took a year out. I was like, I'll defer this for 1 year because it's just a lot back to back. And during that year that I deferred, I signed up for an online course called, it was like, it wasn't called Blogging 101, but it was like new media. And it was through a website which still exists, called writers.com. I think they're based in Seattle, out of Seattle. And in that class, we had to create a blog using Blogger, right? So, whoa.
The next
Yeah.
version.
Yeah. So we had to create a blog, and they would give us assignments each week. And there was a writing tutor, Amanda. She's actually a very successful um, travel writer. And then there was a tech tutor. So he would give us things to do, like, hey, embed a YouTube video in this week's post, or what, like stuff like that. So I actually learned a fair bit. You wouldn't know it talking to me today, but I learned a fair bit about coding and HTML at that point. It was like way over my head. But anyway, I really enjoyed it. And there was sort of 10 of us in the course, and we all got addicted to commenting and getting comments on our blog. So that's very OG mentality as well, the whole comment
Yeah.
thing. And I love that. And after the course ended, I made my blog public in 2009. Back then, there were a lot of bloggers writing because they wanted to get a book deal. That was never me. I'm like, no, I'm too sensible. There's no way I could write a book and hold down a full-time job. Well, wait. I didn't, that wasn't the reason I was blogging. I was blogging because I love the process of it, and I love the connection with other people writing blogs. At the time, there was a website called Food Buzz, and it was kind of like a little Facebook for food bloggers.
Oh,
And
interesting.
I made lots and lots of friends in by participating in that website. I won a trip to San Francisco to demonstrate a recipe live in front of an audience for Bertolli pasta sauces. Anyway, I was throwing myself in, like, head in the deep end there,
And
just
all
doing.
this while you're still teaching
Yep.
and learning and
Yeah.
busy.
Yeah. But I did like, back then blogging was a lot easier. There was a lot less focus on the photos and a lot less focus on design, and it was really about the content, and it was that I loved doing. I love creating that content. And it was kind of like a little break at the end of my day, like teach, 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 full on, full on, full on. And then I get home, and some people go for a run. Well, that's me now, but some people cook dinner. That's also me. And I would sit down and write like a little recipe up or something. And then just people seemed to really connect with what I was doing. I was writing a little bit about, traveling in France as well, because I was still traveling a fair bit at that point. Um, so anyway, that was me blogging away from 2009 onwards, and not really. Everyone was like, oh, you're going to get a book deal, but that was not my goal. And lots of bloggers were getting book deals. It was like blog to book. That was that era. And I just was like, oh, that's not me. Nobody would ever want to buy my stuff. Nobody would ever want to buy a book full of my recipes. So I didn't really pursue that. That wasn't something that I cared too much about at that point. In 2013, I founded an organization called Food Bloggers of Canada with two friends. There was a food blogging association in the States, but there wasn't anything that was Canadian. So we decided there was a gap in the market, and we were going to fill it with this association. So through FBC, I made a lot of connections to not only other bloggers, but also brands and publishing houses. and I guess maybe I got a little bit more on the map, like more people sort of knew who I was and what I was doing. We put on the first, oh, that was actually not 2013, it was 2011.
So was
So
that
yeah,
like an online community then that you created, or and did you meet up in person too, or how
so
did that
it
work?
was originally just sort of an online, it was a website. It's still there. We had like a forum where people could interact and connect, and we did try to do in-person, meetups and activities and events. It was hard though because I was in Toronto, the other two were living in BC. Canada's a big country, so you kind of need reps in every province, and uh yeah. So
Yeah.
that was another thing that was a lot to manage. But I
That
guess,
doesn't surprise me, Marty. I feel
yeah,
like you always have big projects on your plate.
yeah. Anyway, it was great because we got to know a lot more of the blogging community. We put on the very first FBC conference in April 2013. It was during an ice storm, and there was no power for a little bit on the first day. It was great. Anyway, it was excellent. It was still, I'm biased, but it was still one of my favorite conferences ever. Just sort of putting it together and watching it come together was really rewarding. Seeing all the connections that were made, the people meeting in person for the first time who just had previously known each other through their blogs. And we were pretty big on Twitter. We used to do Twitter parties. Do you remember those?
Oh my goodness, yeah.
Dating myself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, I have other clients too that that's how they got started was on Twitter, which is similar to that. So it's interesting to hear the backstory of how all of the technology and people connected with the
Yeah.
different limited resources back then. Now there's so many different ways you can connect, but Twitter really did help a lot of people get started.
Yeah, it really did. And they did an amazing job, the other two, of growing the Twitter account. And I interacted with it as well. So, lots of people want to interact with, food bloggers. So brands and, publishers and, magazines and things like that. So yeah, I guess that was really helpful for sort of getting my name out there on the map. I got a lot of work out of some of those connections, which was great. And then I left in 2013 because it was too much. For once, Marty says it's enough. It was too much having that because that was turning into like a business.
So to
Um,
say a full-time job,
yeah,
right?
my blog was pretty taking up a fair amount of my time as well. I loved it, but it was taking up a lot of my time. And I just was like, I don't think I can give this what it needs, like the amount of me time that it needs for the food bloggers. So I left in 2013, after that first conference, sort of on a high. And then in 2014, we bought our house in the southwest of France. So that's another thing that now is occupying my time. So it was good that I got out of that when I did, because there's no way with another business I would be able to have enough time to do all the things as well as I want to do them.
Yeah.
So yeah, and then they continue to run those in-person conferences. It was great. And in 2015, I was sponsored by a company. I think it was Mushrooms Canada, maybe a recipe contest that I might have won. And I got to go to that conference. It was in Montreal in October of 2015. And at that conference, I met Zoe Maslow, who was then with Appetite by Random House, soon to become the editor of my first cookbook. And we hung out a little bit at the conference. We chatted a little bit. And she was like, we think you've got a really interesting story. And like, I guess I did. It's a little bit all over the place, but she was like, we'd love to know if you've got a story that you could write into a book. And I was like, whoa, that's, it's one thing having an interesting story. it's another thing writing a proposal of that.
Yes.
So they were interested in seeing a proposal of what I could do for them. So I spent a couple of months on a proposal. I did not want to write a cookbook. Um, so it was more like a sort of a memoir with recipes.
Hmm.
There's a lot of that around now. I would have too much competition if I was to do that these days.
Right.
Um, but yeah, so in
So did you
December,
propose to them initially, then more of a memoir with recipes,
yeah,
or yeah, so that
yeah,
is what you proposed.
yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, with all of your history and just the backstory that you just shared, I can see that being something that you would want to lead with. So how did she kind of persuade you to go a different route?
Well, there was no persuading. I spent 2 months writing the proposal. And in December, I presented it to her and the publisher, the head of Appetite, and they took it away. They took it to acquisitions. There's so many other levels of, like, if one person in the company loves it, it doesn't mean that they're going to give you a book deal. There's a lot of levels of people that have to approve it, and sales and marketing have to give it the green light. Acquisitions have to be confident that it's going to sell. So yeah, anyway, in February of 2016, they came back to me and said, this is a great concept, but we're not going to take it. And so
Mm,
what I didn't know at the time is that publishing companies know, like, 3-4 years in advance their editorial calendar, like what they're doing in
correct.
advance, which
Yeah.
I had no idea that that's how it worked. I mean, why would I? And so they were like, this is great. We're not going to take it. We're going to be publishing something in a couple of years that might be in a similar category. So that's not, you don't want to have competing books within one publishing company. So anyway, she was like, we went out for a drink, and she was like, so we loved it, but we'd love you to write a kids cookbook. And at the time, I had been blogging about my kids cooking club at school. So I didn't have to blog about it, but I wanted to because I loved it so much. I had a once a week after school club where I taught kids to cook. I teach at an all boys school, so I guess it was something a little bit different. Everyone loved it. Everyone loved the photos I was sharing on social media because it's like little hands making real food. So I guess they were sort of going that route. They were like, hey, she could write about kids cooking. And I just, before she'd even finished the sentence, I just was like, no, I'm not doing a kids cookbook. Um, at the time, I was in my late 40s, and I was like, I don't want to be known for, like, I write the kids cookbook. And certainly it had to have like a hook. It had to be more interesting than just a regular kids
Regular.
cookbook.
Sure.
Yeah, it would have to have some kind of interest factor that would make it stand out. So that night I came home and I started Googling, like, kids cookbooks and ones that were successful and ones that were a little bit different. And all of a sudden, because we had bought this house in France, and I was like all about marketing the house, like, yes, we have to get interest in the house and interest in my website, and then people will buy a book. So it's like, why not a kids cookbook teaching kids how to cook French food? Because I knew that it could be done because I'd done it with my students. And there didn't seem to be a lot of competition in that area, because you've always got to tell them, if you're proposing something, you've always got to do your research and be like, here are some books that could be in competition.
Correct.
And there were not a lot. Um, and certainly none that I was like, oh my God, that's such a great book. I would totally use that. So it's like, I'm going to write the book that I would use with my own students. I wanted it to be pretty. I wanted it to be easy to use. I wanted it to have real food in it. So not just like English muffin pizzas and things like that. There's nothing wrong with that, but I wanted it to prove that kids can do more than the basics. So I was like, why not propose that to them? Because that brings in all the things that I love, and I love to teach. I love to teach French. It could have some little language lessons in there. It could have, tips for teaching kids to cook. Um, yeah, anyway, so I proposed that to them, and I think in May of that year. So this is like a really long drawn out process, is what I'm trying to point out.
Right.
In May of 2016, I got an offer for the kids French cookbook, as it was known in my contract. So yeah, and I signed the contract in August, started working in September of 2016. It came out in July of 2018.
Oh, wow.
So
Yeah, it
yeah.
takes, and
Yep.
that's what we tell a lot of people when they want to go that traditional publishing route. It does take about 2 to 3 years to
Yeah.
get, and like you also said too, the publishers it's almost like they have to foresee the future as to
Yeah.
what people are going to buy, which I think is amazing and crazy at the same time, because
Yeah.
so how can you foresee some of these things? But they do,
Yeah.
they really do map
They
out a
know.
trajectory. They're the ones that
They
are
know it.
pushed. That's how we get the trends as a consumer, because the publishers are actually making the trends, which
Yeah.
is quite interesting.
Yeah.
um yeah, so it takes a long time. So when you started working with them, so they were all new recipes. So you had to develop all
Um,
of those, or were they some from your blog, or it was a mix of
some
things?
some were adapted from my blog, but there had to be a certain percent that were original,
Right.
because why would people buy a book if they could get something for free online? Which is fair enough. But yeah, they wanted 100 recipes because I think that looks good on the cover, and it sounds good for SEO, like over 100 recipes to teach your kid how to cook French food.
Yeah.
And I was
And it
like,
gives a substantial book size if you're
yeah,
doing almost a image per recipe too. It also helps with
yeah,
page count. Yeah.
exactly. But I said to them, I was just like, I spent a long time on the recipe list, and I came up with like 80 recipes, and I was like, I think this is enough. I can't, I could, but I just don't want to like just throw things in there for the sake of it. So yeah, that took a really long time. I worked on the recipes for probably 3 or 4 months. The recipe list took a few weeks to kind of finalize and approve. And then yeah, it's like, okay, now we're going to be getting a photographer, and here's your designer, and all of this stuff that I hadn't known anything about, hadn't thought about, didn't know what sort of decisions I needed to make or things I needed to think about. So luckily I got my choice of photographer. That's not always the case, as far as I
Right.
understand. Sometimes they'll give you the photographer that this is who we want you to work with. You know, they have their people, and
Yeah.
that's great.
They have their
I
stable. It's ready
yeah,
and ready and waiting.
yeah.
Yes.
I luckily have a friend who is a food photographer. She'd done cookbooks before. She'd done cookbooks with Penguin, which is the parent company of Appetite. So I knew that she would know like what to do. She was also working on her own cookbook at the time with her husband, partner. So why not throw in an extra book at the same time?
While you're
Um,
shooting that, you can shoot
yeah.
this. Yeah.
Well, she was really interested in my book because it's very different from anything else on her resume. So, if you're a photographer, it's good to show like I can do all sorts of types of images.
And did you make the food for her to photograph? Did you end up having to hire, a food stylist, although like a chef, someone to actually make your recipes? How did that work with that
So
book?
I thought that it was going to be me. Of course, I knew nothing, but no, it's a food stylist,
Mhm.
and so that was another thing that I didn't know about. But luckily, she had worked with a Toronto-based food stylist who was current at the time. She was living in London, but she was moving back to Toronto. So Dara came in and worked her magic on the food. So Dara, a stylist, and Kyla, the photographer, they'd worked together before. So I felt like that's an excellent point. It's a good reason to hire them together.
Yeah.
One less kind of relationship that's unknown in the mix is good, because I was like, I don't know one of them. I do know the other one. I don't know this process at all. So I figured if they'd work together, they would have a routine, a rhythm, and they did. So anyway, they were great. They understood that I was clueless, and they talked me through everything. They were very patient. And they agreed that because I was like, this is great and everything, but I want some of the images to be shot in France because it's a French cookbook. And happen to have a friend who has a cooking school in Lyon. The cooking school is called Plum Lyon, and my friend is Lucy, and her husband Loic is French, and they vetted the recipe list for me.
Oh, wow. That's great.
Lucy had lived in France. They had a seven, and then at the time 7 year old, Jan, and they had vetted the recipe list for me, so they knew what would and wouldn't be authentic sort of French food.
So did
I
you end
was
up shooting in France then?
Yeah, but like come September
Was
of
it the
20,
same team that went out, or was it? Oh,
yep.
wow. Wow. And did the publisher pay for that as well? Or did they have to pay like for their like accommodations and things like that? That was interesting.
The publisher paid me an advance, which didn't cover their costs.
Got it.
Um, so when we went to France, I stayed with Lucy, and she had an Airbnb at the time, and I put them up at a hotel down the street, so they were close by the kitchen and close by me. I paid for that. I feel like it was a worthwhile investment.
Mhm.
And so we spent a week in Lyon. We worked with Lucy's son and his friends. They all came to the kitchen and they cooked, and we took all those great little hand shots. And, we went to markets and we got inspiration, and it was really great. So I am really happy that we did that. It made me feel like, okay, the vision is coming together. But
And
no,
that
that
the
was,
whole piece about the advance, that's also something too that a lot of first time authors are not really sure how that works when it comes to how much do you get as an advance and what goes towards the book and who pays for what. So it is
yeah,
interesting just hearing that, the publisher did cover a lot in letting you choose the photographer, and did they pay for all the photography but not the
no,
no, they didn't. So that's interesting. Yeah.
yeah. Lots of people I know, they'll choose the photographer and the photographer will bill the publisher, but
Hmm.
that didn't happen for me. It doesn't happen for a lot of people. And the advance depends on who you are and how many books you've written and how successful they think it will be. So my advance was quite small. But the great thing about that is the advance they take off of any royalties that you earn. So I earned out my advance in the first royalty period, which is
That's amazing.
amazing.
Yes.
And 5 years later, I'm still earning royalties, which is fantastic. It means the book is still selling, which is great. But yeah, no, the ingredients and stuff, like I covered all of that myself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's, I mean, now think about, well, you know how it is now, like ingredients now are even
Yeah.
more, like it's so expensive to create a cookbook, and not just in production value, but also in just creating the content and,
Yeah.
testing like how many times do you have to make the same recipe and buy those same
Yeah.
ingredients and pull that out, which is quite interesting.
Yeah.
So the publisher, then they gave you some control in terms of
Yeah.
creativity. How did you feel about the rest of the process with them?
So yeah, the control piece is something that nobody can really prepare you for. It's their book, right? Like they're publishing it, so they do ultimately have the final say in things like the design, the cover. I had no idea that the cover was such an issue until I talked to other people, but apparently it's very unusual that you get your pick of cover as the author. Oftentimes it's picked for you.
Yeah.
Now, I had a very strong vision in my head about what I wanted there to be on the cover, the font and everything. And I got a bit of pushback, a fair bit of pushback. But I was like, I have to look at this goddamn book for the next rest of my life. I want to love it.
And you
So
had to sell it. It's got your name on it. Like it's something
yeah,
that's following your brand. Your brand is
yeah,
going to be, bolstering the sales for it. So it's kind of,
exactly. Yeah. So I sort of wasn't prepared for those questions about the cover and the design and stuff. I didn't want it to be too pretty pink pastel Eiffel Tower. That's what I didn't want it to be. I wanted it to be accessible to whichever kid wanted to cook. And I think we did a pretty nice job. I sort of like was like, no pastels, no pretty. I don't want it to be like pretty, all style and no substance. But there are things in the book that I would have fought for more now that I've seen it and now I've heard feedback about it. The font is pretty small, which led to my decisions about fonts in the work we did together.
Yeah.
The font is pretty small and it's pretty faint. It's pretty hard to read. Like I find it hard to read, and I know the recipes. So, yeah, stuff that you have got no idea that you're going to have to think about. And I'm sure you, working with people self-publishing, you've got to hold their hand and guide them through this process.
Yeah.
Um, I sort of, with you, I felt like, oh, I kind of know what's coming next. I'm going to get prepared for that, because I'd been through it once. And it, at the end of the day, the creative piece, like creating the book, whether it's self-publishing or traditional, you go through the same
Same
steps.
steps.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah.
Mhm.
So that book, it's a success. You're still receiving, royalties from that, which is amazing. And I think that, just like you said, it gave you this insight into what to expect when creating a cookbook or a book of any sort, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cookbook in particular, though, with all of the creative decisions that have to kind of go into it. But I think you and I had met through, I think it was maybe Sally Eckes, possibly. And
Yeah.
um so so obviously, like, so Sally is she's a cook, like an agent, a cookbook agent, and she works with creatives just like yourself, to help them get traditionally published deals. So the work that so your connection with Sally, was that because you were thinking about publishing the next book and you weren't sure which way you wanted to go? But how did that kind of relationship then lead you to us over here?
Well, I knew of Sally. Obviously, everyone knows of Sally. And I had put out in a group, a private group on Facebook, like, I'm thinking of self-publishing. I've got all my recipes. Well, I got many of my recipes, and I don't want to learn the design piece. Like that's one part of. I just don't think. I don't think that it's something that I could have gotten on top of. And so I got lots of advice, not necessarily in that group, but in that group, everyone was like, Sally will know someone. So Sally knew of you. And I looked at some of your like previous clients who I also was familiar with. But lots of people were like, hey, you can just do it as a PowerPoint and then make a PDF. I'm like, no, I don't want that sort of self-published book.
Yeah.
I wanted to, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I do that at school with my students. It's great. Baby publishing, but I didn't want that to be what I was putting out there in the world. So I was like, I'm gonna have to pay someone to do the design. I cannot learn this. I wouldn't have had time. That was when it was in 2021 that we started working
Yeah.
together.
Mhm.
And I knew already, like, just from the traditional process, how long everything would take. And I was like, I want one of these books out this year. I don't want it like next year or the year after. So the idea that I had was a follow-up book. The book, In the French Kitchen with Kids, which is my first book. Can you believe I've made it this far without mentioning the
I
name?
know.
So In the French Kitchen with Kids had a lot of success, sure, with parents with kids, but also just with adults who didn't have a lot of experience cooking or baking. And so I started thinking about, hey, there's something in this. It's not just for kids. My recipes are good for everybody. So I had been giving online classes, baking and cooking classes in 2020. And I'd had to come up with a whole bunch of new recipes, and people wanted the French food. So I was like, hey, I got all these new recipes. So I did actually go back to my publisher and propose them a follow-up book. You got to be really famous to get a follow-up book, like Jamie Oliver, Nigella,
Yeah,
Ina Garten, and so that wasn't something that they were interested in at the time. So I was like, okay, but I got all these things. I want to get them out. I want to get them photographed. I want to get them out of my system. So that's when I started asking around in my circle of writing friends, photography friends, blogging friends, like, how could I get this done? And you came so highly recommended. Um, and honestly, like, the cost was less than I thought it would be. And if you balance it out over how long it would have taken me to learn all the things that you know how to do,
absolutely. Yes.
yeah, very good value for money there. So,
And you
uh,
came to me with a pretty like specific model that you wanted to follow. So it was
yeah,
a little different than like you had put a lot of thought into this. So it wasn't just like I am going to just create a whole new cookbook and that's the end of it. You have so I would love for you to talk about that because this is you're doing this, it is self-published. It's also being published print on demand, which is a little bit different for
yeah,
some people. But then also the way that you approached it so that it didn't become an overwhelming product. How did you like, how did you come up with that thought around what you did and tell us a little bit about that idea that you had to kind of break this out into multiple products instead of just
yeah.
one cookbook at a time?
So I knew that one cookbook would be like 75, 80 recipes. And I was thinking that that would be a little bit too overwhelming to manage both the copy and the photography and the testing all at the same time, especially if I wanted it to come out in within that year, within that 12-month period. So I started looking at the chapters that I had, and they were like breakfast, lunch, dinner, after school snacks, dessert. So I was like, hey, that's really, maybe we could just publish these as um, separate books, like little mini books, little chapters
Mm-hmm.
separately. So that, if you're not into baking, you don't have to buy all the baking ones. Like, who are these people not into baking? But um, yeah. So the first one we did was at your recommendation was after school snacks that came out in September of 21, just in time for back to school. And so that came out, and then crazily, I published the dinner one 3 months
That was
after
that
that.
was
So
fast. That was fast and furious.
fast and fierce, a bit intense, but we got it done. Um, and I think once you've done one, you sort of know what the process is, what's coming next, what to expect.
Yeah.
So I sort of had in my calendar, like, all right, by this date, I'm going to need the photos, I'm going to need the copy, I'm going to need the recipes tested. And but having done that for the traditional publisher, I sort of knew the process, and I knew what your process was as well. The sort of things you'd be expecting and your turnaround times, which is important,
Right.
because you'd be like, hey, this is great, but we need this in 2 days. Or I'd be like, hey, I gave you this, but can you change it into something completely different in one day?
Yeah.
Um, like, just sort of what to expect in terms of what was reasonable. Um,
And I think even going back to when we started, and you had a vision, just like you said with the traditional published book,
yeah,
about the look and feel. And you did come to me saying, I don't want this to feel, I want it to feel like it's part of the same series as my first book, but
yes,
I don't want it
yeah,
to be the same. And
yeah,
I don't want it to feel like it is, you know, what people think French and Paris, all of those sort of stereotypical things, like
yeah,
no Eiffel Towers. No.
yeah,
But it was more of like really the feeling that you wanted to get through it and we
yeah,
used some fun textures or patterns that
yeah,
just really indicated it just kind of gave that little hint of France and things
yeah,
that like these little novelties. But then we really came up with a knowing that we wanted to build this out over time. We wanted to come up with a solid
yeah, like a
template.
vision
So
that we could keep going.
that we
Yeah.
could keep going. So we wanted it to fit with any of the topics that we were
Yep.
talking about,
Yeah.
which was great. And also, I think in your first book, you had the little illustrations, and we were able to carry those out, which was a
Yes.
nice little tie between the two products.
Yeah.
So I think that the template really did help us to build out the process that we created that first with the first book. And then when we went ahead and did the next two, they got faster and faster, I think, in terms of the actual finished product getting from point A to point B. So
Definitely.
so we decided to use KDP, which is Amazon's print on demand platform. And we've had some, ups and downs with the platform, but I do think it's worked out pretty well in terms of allowing us to do what we want to do. And we were able to connect the books as a series, which also helps when somebody comes to the Amazon page, that they can see the other products that are by you
Yeah.
that are all part of the same series.
It's very
um
helpful. Yeah.
yeah, it's really helpful. But I'm curious, like, since these were not through the publisher, this is for you, or
Mhm.
through you, self-published. When it came time for marketing, did you do anything different in terms of how you pushed people to that product?
It's, to be honest, it's been really hard when you're all by yourself and you don't have a marketing team. You get a marketing team for, I'd say, like the month around publishing date. With a
Mhm.
traditional publisher, it's not, you don't get assigned a marketing team forever. But they do have connections and contacts, and they get you the interviews and the TV spots. And if you don't have that, it's really hard to market, and it's a lot of work. And without it feeling like, oh, here I am selling my book again, um, overkill. It's very, I would say, like the book comes out and then the hard work begins to try to sell it. So if I'm being honest, I have not done as much on the pushing of those books as I could have. But the last couple of years, everyone's just done what their best, right?
Yeah.
So what I've tried to do is incorporate the books in classes that I teach, either online classes or in-person classes here in Toronto. It seems sort of a natural fit, like come to the class and the book is included in the price, and then you've got more eyes on your book, and people are seeing the recipes, they're making a recipe from the book. So those sort of feels a little bit more natural ways to promote it than always just being like, buy my book, buy my book. I find that really hard. The marketing piece is a challenge. There's always more that we could be doing. Like, that again is work. And
It
I think
is
a lot of
work.
people don't realize, like, that, okay, the book is published, but then you got to sell it. Especially if, you've put your own money into the design piece. You sort of at least want to make that money back through sales. And I definitely could have done a lot more in the last couple of years to sell these self-published books. And it's really surprised me because I initially imagined that people would want to buy the ebooks. So
Right.
the books are print on demand and as ebooks.
Correct. Yes.
And they have,
Yep.
yeah,
I almost forgot about the ebooks. I don't know why I almost forgot about those, but yeah, we also converted them so that they are ebook format as well. And
yeah. And that's,
that was another big thing, that a hurdle, I think, even just the communication between myself and you to understand what it meant for, it's not going to look just like the book, or there's going to
yeah,
be little nuances that, it's a digital product. It's like a website. So even
yeah,
just, yeah, I think the ebooks, when it comes to cookbooks, are kind of hit or miss. I think what's nice about an ebook connected to a cookbook is it does allow for, like, when you are ready to do more promotion, it allows you to do more, because through
yeah,
the KDP format, um, there's less that you can do for a print book. So with the actual ebook, you can run sales and you can run
yeah,
promos. So it's nice that you have them. They're there and ready for you to do that work when you are ready to tackle that side. It's kind of
yeah.
an interesting conundrum to have, because not a lot of people are, I feel like, going for the ebook cookbooks, but it still is super valuable when it
Yeah.
comes to digital marketing, especially through the Amazon platform.
Hmm. I would agree. It's good to give people options and
Yeah.
choices. And people interact with cookbooks differently. Some people hate ebooks and some people love them, love the accessibility of them. I like to write all over my cookbooks, so that's not possible on an ebook. The only thing that I wish that KDP had was spiral binding. That's
Yeah.
the only thing. I love a spiral bound cookbook. I love that it lays flat. I love that it's easy to find the things in there when you're searching, and that the pages turn nicely. So Neil, my partner, has a print division at his work, and he's done a few print runs of the books with spiral binding, and everyone's always like, "These are awesome," and I'm like, "Sorry, can't get them on Amazon." I know there are some places where you can self-publish that do that. It brings the price up like considerably, the spiral binding,
Yeah.
just because of the materials cost, I guess. But no, I think the KDP platform is pretty, like it's pretty simple to you. Well, not for me, but like it's pretty simple for me to go in and do what I need to do in there.
Yeah.
Um, and once the book is in there, you're right. There's certainly with the ebook, there's options for it can go on Kindle Unlimited or what. Like there's lots of things that I have not even looked at
Yeah.
yet. But
So
so I
that
would say,
it's there, it's all there waiting for you.
exactly. There's lots of options for sure. And I would say if you're thinking about self-publishing, those are some things to in your downtime, like when the book is being worked on or whatever, those are some things to think about. And there are lots of forums of self-published authors to help with things like, hey, what could I do to market my book? And there's always lots of help available online. There's some forums there on Amazon as well. I'm sure you've probably got like tons of things that I could be
Tons of
doing.
things that we could be
Yeah,
doing, but it is all
yeah,
about like timing too. What's nice is that like you have three products up there now.
yeah.
So you go ahead, you can mention which three are that we've completed at this point. We've got
We've got after school snacks, le goûter. We've got le dîner, so dinner recipes, and we just put out le petit déjeuner, breakfast. So yeah, there's three different things there. And if you're not into the baking, you'll probably buy the dinner if you're interested in that.
yeah.
Because the other two are certainly more baking focused. But my hope is that I'm offering choices and options for people who maybe aren't into, certain aspects of French food. I know somebody recently on Amazon just gave my first book a bad review and said focuses on desserts and baking. And I'm like,
That was yeah. That was
yep,
the point of
the
that
French food.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So my hope is that, maybe some people are buying a couple chapters, but not all of them. But eventually we, meaning me and you, will have all of the content for the full book that I had envisioned years ago,
Mhm.
French Food for Everyone. All the chapters will be ready. And maybe, I don't know, Leanna's probably like, oh my God, this is such a big job, but to put it all together in one big book and
Yeah.
maybe put that for sale. If people like one chapter, they're like, oh, this is great, but I don't want to buy all the chapters separately. Well, here's the book all together.
Yeah.
So I feel like it was a good way to get the content out in public quicker than if I was doing the traditional route, or if I was just being like, Leanna, I got 75 recipes. We're going to make one book. That would have taken a really long time. So this way we're getting like little teasers out in the world and getting people excited about, hey, actually lunch is coming next. Um,
That
lunch
was
is
my
going to,
next question. Do you know what
yeah,
is coming next?
yeah. There's lunch, and what are the other chapters? The other chapters are going to be and dessert and lunch. So 5 chapters, yeah. So 5 chapters between 10 and 12 recipes each.
Mhm.
So that's a good chunk of recipes if you add them all up, if we put them all together in one.
Yeah.
Um,
And we've
yeah,
really stuck to our format, which is going to make it turning it into a full product so much easier because we didn't, stray from it. We really stuck with the
the
formatting
template.
of
Yeah.
those templates. And I think that really helped. It's going to help in the future with the other chapters, but then also that final product.
Hmm.
So, what surprised you about self-publishing? Even though it was still the same process as, the traditional in a sense, was there anything that stuck out that was um, a good surprise? Not necessarily, because we did have a couple weird bad surprises.
We had some phone calls to Amazon KDP. We did, desperate before Christmas phone calls.
Yeah,
This is going to come out in the next 24 hours. No, things that surprised me are how good the books look.
they look
Um,
great.
and that's not meant to be like dissing you or your work at all, but like when you think, well, when we did think self-publishing years ago, it wasn't this beautiful professional result that I think we have. So yeah, the KDP books, I send them to people, and people like my parents are always like, "Oh, it looks like a real book." Yep, that's because I guess they're not, when you hear self-publishing, you don't really necessarily know what to expect. And some people still think that I'm like churning them out in my basement. They're like, "Can I order 3 copies?" I'm like, "Here's the Amazon link."
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Neil is
So
not printing these for you. It is Amazon. Yes.
yeah. I mean, so that's the thing, is that, looking at like how good those ones look, the spiral bound ones, I started thinking, oh, I wonder if I could, but that's like distribution and mailing, and I don't think I could.
Well, we should talk
So,
about that because I have an idea for you. So
okay.
we should talk about that because things are changing. That's the other side of self-publishing. The landscape keeps changing. There's more options and more and things are being there. You're able to integrate them more with these tools like KDP and
Yeah.
Amazon. And so there's definitely different ways that you can add different formats and things like that. So we'll definitely talk about that. But I had a pleasure working with you on this because, like I said, you came with a vision. You knew what you liked, what you didn't like. Getting even just sample pages, working on those with you was so like it was so I don't want to say easy, but you did.
Well,
We
I
you
have
knew.
strong opinions. Yeah.
Yes, you
Yeah.
knew. So you knew the typefaces, you knew the color palette. We had a couple little like tweaks in there, but for the most part, like we were able to get through that piece of the process pretty quickly, which then
Yeah.
led to just making sure that that template was right because we had to make sure that the type size was right. That you knew how much your longest recipes were. We tried to keep everything on a page.
Hmm.
um some of the dinner recipes like you can't, so we have had to adjust a little bit, but for the most part everything really did follow that initial vision that you had.
Yeah. And then we were even able to squeak in some step-by-step image pages, which was
Yeah.
really helpful.
Yep.
That
And
I
you took
didn't.
all the photos. This is,
Yes.
you really, with this series, you really, have even dialed in your skills from the beginning. So every time you send me stuff, I'm like, this looks amazing. So even that side of it has really like fleshed itself out, I think,
Yeah. I
over the
mean,
last 3 products.
definitely shooting all the images myself is a lot of work. It's also not my forte. Like photography is not the thing that I do really well. But I did, I hung out on those photo shoots for in the French kitchen with kids. And I learned a lot, like looking at the questions they were asking themselves and how they set shots up. And, like literally, if you ask Neil, like the whole of 21, our front room in our house is our, in theory, it's a dining room. It has a dining table. And it was just like that's where I shot all the recipes.
It's
So
your production
all
set.
this all the stuff was just there. And sometimes I'd be like, I'm not 100% about this photo. So I'm just not going to eat these things or give them to my neighbors. And I'm just going to leave the setup like, okay, the placemat stays here. The placemat, the glass has got to go in this spot. I had lots of little stickies all over the place, like lining things up. And yeah, so I learned to do stuff like that from watching like Kyla and Dara.
Yeah.
um so yeah, but that's definitely, it's a lot of work. Like the photos are a lot of work. And like I struggle with some of them. I'd be like, it's all brown food, I can't get this one down. The covers were really important to me. They had to look like they were part of the same series. I am thrilled with how they've turned out. Like the photos, I look at them and I can't believe that I took them.
They
So
look great. They really do. So, if you had to give a little nugget of advice to someone who is in a similar spot where they want to self-publish some like their cookbook, they're not really sure, I guess, where to start. Is there any little tidbits or insight that you can share to kind of get them started?
I would say it's worthwhile paying somebody to do something that you don't want to learn how to do or that you don't have time. So if I had needed to, the photos, I might have outsourced that. The design, 100%, I was like, that's not where I want to go with my time. Um, but yeah, don't be afraid. Like it's money that you're investing like out of pocket, but hopefully you'll make that back, or you'll at least learn stuff. Like I do think I wanted to do the photos for In the French Kitchen with Kids, and that was shut down. They were like, not at all. And I was devastated, but now I see what it entailed. I'm like, no, there's no way I could have done it for 75 recipes or whatever. Um, so yeah, for the self-publishing, figure out what you're really good at and get ahead on that. Like I was really good at writing the recipes and getting the copy down. And so I'd just be like, all right, I've done all of this. And now, oh my God, I've got to go and shoot these things again. Um, yeah, figure out what you're good at. Use that to your advantage to save some time for other areas that you're maybe not so good at. And be patient, right? It's not just because you're self-publishing doesn't mean it's going to come out tomorrow.
No, it still takes time. And even when you press publish on Amazon, it takes time.
Yep,
We learned that.
we
Um,
have. Yeah.
but Marty, it's been so great chatting with you. What I personally love is just hearing just how all of your experiences really came full circle into the first book that you created, and then also the trajectory that you took after that. So I really appreciate you spending this time with me. I know you have a busy schedule. That does not
Yeah.
surprise me, but you'll have to just let everyone know where they can find you, what again, reiterate the names of the books so that they know where to go on Amazon. We'll include it all in the show notes, but
Yeah.
definitely let us know where they can find you.
So my website is called eatlivetravelright.com. And I am Eat Live Trav Right on Twitter and Instagram, because back in the good old days, Twitter only let you have a certain amount of characters for your handle. So it's EATLIVTRAVWRITE. Everyone gets it wrong. But if they're in the show notes, that's great. So I'm pretty active on Instagram, mostly in stories right now. I'm a bit put off the feed of Instagram. I'm having a bit of a moment with it. But Twitter, I'm sort of on. My blog does have a Facebook page, but it's not super active. But yeah, I am actively storying away on Instagram most days. Yeah.
Love it.
And the books are called, the first one is In the French Kitchen with Kids. The second series of books is called French Food for Everyone. And then it's after school snacks, dinner, and breakfast are out already. And lunch
Perfect.
is coming up soon.
No, they are out already, ready for you
Yeah.
to purchase.
Yeah.
And like I said, I'll make sure that we have all those links in the show notes so that you can get your copies. But Mardi, it's been a pleasure, and I can't wait to start book number 4.
But yeah, no, well, thanks for having me. I feel a little bit like a bit of a fraud here. The creative person that sort of fell into the creative process by accident, despite saying that she didn't want to ever write books. Now here I am like doing my own. Um, but yeah, it's really good to have you there electronically holding my hand. I think that's really important, like the relationship with somebody that is going to be your designer or your photographer or your food stylist or your editor. Oh, that's one thing that we did for the last book is we got it professionally
Yes, you did.
proofread, which is
Mhm.
great. So you've got all those contacts, which is really useful. If you're self-publishing, use the contacts of your people because it saves you a bunch of time like searching around for them. And use that expertise and learn from it. I always sort of thought, oh yeah, I can probably like learn how to do this. Leanne is just going to let me drop things into the template after second book, but I don't think that's happening. Not
Nope.
yet. Yeah.
Oh, this was fun, Marty.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.